Thank you, Caroline. Okay, so for those of you that want to follow along at home, I've put up the URL early so that you guys can cheat and look ahead if you so decide. Hope everybody's having a wonderful afternoon. I know it's beautiful out, and I'm the last speaker, so without further ado, mobile and offline data synchronization in AngularJS. So a little bit about me. I'm a longtime JavaScript programmer. I'm a former extreme programming consultant for Google and Pivotal, and I started using AngularJS a little over 2 years ago now. I started the meetup, as Caroline mentioned, and Zen Digital was a former consulting agency of mine that I reformed recently to take advantage of newer technologies, so web and mobile and the latest technologies. So here's a quick outline of the talk so you'll know where I'm going with this. So I'm going to talk about the requirements for AngularJS data models and the old school techniques that we're currently using for persisting our data, offline issues and what that brings about, local storage options, and I'm going to do a sample application walkthrough with Ionic and PouchDB. So what are the requirements for data models in AngularJS? Anyone? Absolutely nothing. There is no prerequisite for your data models in Angular. And that actually causes a problem for some people. I was brought in as a consultant to a corporate outfit, and they had multiple Angular projects going on, and they were all like, well, how should we build our models? What's the style? And everybody was looking for the prevailing logic, and there wasn't one. AngularJS is model agnostic. Any variable or object can serve as a model, and no unique ID is required. No built-in persistence model is available for objects currently, although there's been some discussions for Angular 2.0. And ng model binds JavaScript variables to the user interface, but not to the back end. So the back end persistence is left up to you, and you have to take care of that yourselves. So what does this mean for data persistence? So as I mentioned, there's no standard yet, but here's a link to the AngularJS 2.0 data persistence design doc. There's someone from Firebase, I believe, that's on that team, as well as people from Google. And it's a great document, definitely worthy of investing a little bit of time in. And of course, there's currently many open source storage options. SQL has been around for a very long time. And open source-wise, we've got MySQL and PostgreSQL, and people have written Angular apps that persist to PostgreSQL and MySQL. And of course, very popular right now is NoSQL, such as MongoDB and CouchDB. So the common persistence practice that's been around for a very long time is CRUD. We have the ability to create, read, update, and delete. And each letter in the acronym can map to a standard SQL statement or to an HTTP method. And here I have a little table showing that create, which is a SQL insert, can also be an HTTP put or post. Read, we select in SQL, or we get in HTTP, update, and delete. So typically, we employ a RESTful API, and we have a live app, one that persists while we're using it and is able to read the data from the database as long as we have an internet connection. And common REST practices, outline what the API should look like. And if anybody here has done any Rails development, they probably recognize this style. It's very common. Angular provides an HTTP service, which basically wraps the XML HTTP request API and follows the promise interface. It returns a promise object. It also has the standard methods, the success and error, and here's an example of that code. Hopefully everybody can read that, otherwise you can follow along at home. And for a higher level abstraction, we have resource. It's a service in the module ng resource. This factory lets you interact with server-side data at a higher level. It returns resource with methods for CRUD operations, get, save, query, remove, and delete. Operations can be invoked by the following. Down below, you see HTTP get, class actions, and so the class actions can be either get, save, query, remove, or delete. So if you just substitute those in there, you can see exactly what the API looks like. And there's no need to interact with the low-level HTTP. So it's a higher level abstraction. You can also get access to the HTTP promise if you need to. And here we see an example of that. And here's a link to more information on that if that's what interests you. But what about offline? So this whole model sort of breaks down as soon as you're creating an offline application, because you can't just call your REST API and do persistence, because the web is not available to you. So web apps no longer can be dependent on servers. So solutions, you need richer clients using AngularJS, for instance. And AngularJS obviously can persist information locally in JavaScript, but what happens when you refresh the browser? JavaScript models all get reinitialized. So that's not a usable solution. And for offline first experiences, you need to store the data somehow in the front end, and you need to be able to sync to the server's data store. And there are numerous in-browser databases available, and they're going to be based on some form of local storage technique. And obviously, you're going to need some form of online synchronization to accomplish this type of application. So what have we come to expect in our mobile applications or in our offline applications? I think email is the classic example. Everybody here has a cell phone and has email, and if you're on the subway or if you're on an airplane, you can still read some of your emails. There's a local copy of recent emails. You could delete an email. Of course, it's not actually going to be deleted on the server because you're not connected to the server, you're offline. You could write a new email, and as soon as you go online, that email will get sent. Google Docs keeps pushing the threshold. I think when I started this talk until now, they came out with a new version of Sheets and Docs for Android, and now it's possible to edit and work on your Google Docs while you're offline on your Android phones. And also within the Chrome browser, they've accomplished this for a while now. And obviously they have their Chrome OS. And then there's got to be an issue with the conflict resolution. We need to intelligently merge documents that have multiple edits from different locations. So we have a connectivity lifecycle. Sometimes we're going to be offline, sometimes we're going to be online, and we're going to have to deal with the transition from one to the other. So we're going to need to, in our apps, communicate to the user or hide the connectivity state. So for instance, in a chat app, you might want to say, oh, the person you're talking to has gone offline. Or you might want to indicate that you're offline and the message that you're trying to send will get sent later or not let you send the message while you're offline. You want to enable client-side creation and editing features. So for instance, in a to-do app, you want to still be able to see the tasks that you want to accomplish, and you want to be able to edit them and mark something as done, or edit the title, for instance, of a task. So the application itself, you're going to want to disable or modify or hide features that won't work. So Facebook status updates. The Facebook app, the latest version, still will show you some of your feed when you're offline, but it won't let you post a status while you're offline. You're not allowed to tweet from the Twitter app when you're offline. You want to notify users about possible conflicting data, once again, and you're going to need some sort of conflict resolution tools or merge capabilities in the long run. So these are things that we're all going to need to be thinking about to create our offline applications. So how do you deal with being offline? You could just show a dinosaur like Chrome does and just say you're offline. You're unable to connect to the internet. But we need to stop treating offline as an error condition. We need to treat it as something that's part and parcel of our application. So you can't just say there's a connectivity issue. You have to notify the user we're offline and deal with it accordingly. Try not to block features completely. If you can update, then show old data with a message telling people that this data may be out of date. Let users create data locally to be sent later. And dealing with new incoming data, you have options. So this is when you reconnect. So once I reconnect, if I've got messages that I missed because I was offline and now they're flowing in later, do I want to show the most recent message that's coming in as on the top of my stack Or do I want to put it in chronological order? And this is an issue with email as well. For instance, you might receive an email hours after it was sent because of email relay problems. And are we going to actually show that at the top of our stack because it just came in? Or are we going to put it chronologically when it was written? So we have that choice to make in our application and in our user interface and experience. So what are our local storage options? Or, I'm sorry, I wrote storage twice there. I'll fix that. You can rule your own. HTML5, various versions have access to the local storage. We have IndexedDB or WebSQL, and we could somehow access them directly. But we're all people who use AngularJS as a framework, so there's no reason to go directly to the basic JavaScript. We should be able to find some sort of library that wraps this for us. Open source local storage databases that are capable of syncing, which is where I want to focus here. PouchDB, it's a JavaScript database that syncs with CouchDB. There's Hoodie, another JS database that syncs also with CouchDB. And then there's remotestorage.io. It's an IETF proposed standard. And then, of course, there are proprietary solutions. Now, Firebase, through AngularFire, will transparently reconnect to the server when you go offline or go back online. But it won't necessarily persist your data locally if you shut down the application. So you still have that issue. If you want to have an offline first style application, we need to be able to have the app start even when you have no internet connectivity. So let's look at the pros of Firebase. You could try and roll your own solution using Firebase. It's got a really great AngularJS library, and it's got its three-way data binding, which is really powerful. There's a free developer account, and paid solution gives you premium support. It's a hosted solution, and you can deploy static hosted apps on it. Very powerful. However, it's a proprietary solution, not open source. It's a hosted solution, which is both a pro and a con. Hosted solutions can't run locally on your own servers. So if you wanted to demo something and you don't have internet connectivity, you've got an issue. You can't run a local copy of Firebase. And there is no local storage solution, but something tells me that's something they'll probably want to work on because that's a very powerful feature, and they've already got so many powerful features. So I'll have to ask later what the roadmap is for that. So PouchDB is where I'm going to focus today, is probably I gave that up early, also in the URL for this talk. So the pros, it's open source, and I'm a big fan of open source, AngularJS, open source. Lightweight, cross-browser JavaScript implementation. It syncs with open source CouchDB protocol servers, and there are several. There's a PouchDB version, PouchDB server, which is adding HTTP to a PouchDB application. There's CloudInt, there's Couchbase, and of course there is the original Apache CouchDB implementation, which is what I'm going to be doing my demo with here. And the cons, well, there's no standard AngularJS library yet. There's a promising one that I didn't use for my demo, and I think long-term that's in order for PouchDB to be adopted widespread in AngularJS, or for any sync library to be adopted widespread, local cat storage syncing library, we really need to have an Angular implementation. So I'm going to, unfortunately it's not there yet, so you can't go and download it yet. I'm going to be uploading the source code from my demo that I'm about to give to my GitHub account, and here's the URL. So if you've saved the URL for this slide presentation, you'll be able to look at this later. I'm going to be using Ionic's hybrid mobile app framework, and prerequisites are going to be Node, of course, and CouchDB in this case. And then here are some resources, and now I'm going to give demo application. So let's bring up some code. So here's a simple Ionic framework implementation. I started with the Ionic To-Do app, and I actually then eliminated some of the HTML. I wanted to narrow this down to make this even easier to see, and I'm really glad that I'm going last because you've already seen Ionic today, so you have some familiarity with it that you can build on from here. So I'm including the Ionic bundle, and this gives me both AngularJS as well as the Ionic library. Cordova is going to give us an error during development when we look at it in the browser, but long term, this library is what's going to allow us to compile and release our application for Android or iOS. So I'm going to leave it in. I'm not going to comment it out. I'm going to include the Ionic CSS, and I'm going to have my own application CSS, which we can look at right here. If you've already seen the To-Do app that's on the AngularJS web page, this is pretty much the same CSS. Basically what I'm doing is, if my task is done or complete, I'm going to put a line through it and color it gray. So going back to, so now let's take a look at our HTML. There's very little here. We have our Ionic header bar, and we have a title. It says to-dos. Here, I bet you I can show both at the same time here. Code is big enough. So we have a list of to-do items. We're going to do an ng repeat through them. In our scope, we have an array tasks, and for each task in tasks, we're going to, if it's complete, we're going to add the task.completed. And here we see only one of our 3 tasks is completed, the first one. And let's take a look at our controller. This is it. This is all I wrote for version 1, just so that we could have something up and running fast. And it looks pretty good, thanks to Ionic. So here we have our tasks. So let's take a look. What is version 2? What do we need to make this a fully offline functioning application? Well, the first thing I want to do is I need some interactivity. So I've added just one line. ng click on the item. And let's go and take a look. And that's going to call completion changed. And let's take a look at the JavaScript. So basically, completion change is going to toggle the task's completed state. And let's take a look at version 2 of the app. I'm going to minimize this one, and here we are, version 2. So now I can click on any task and change its state. We see the moment we change the state, we get our line through. This is pretty standard. However, what happens if I hit reload? Everything resets to its original state. So if I undo the first task and do this and say that the second and third one are completed, the moment I quit the app and come back to it, I lose all of that data. So that's an issue that we're going to have to deal with. So now let's take a look. I'm going to add a little bit more functionality. I'm bringing it on really slow, but eventually it's going to speed up. Whoops. So we're going to create a button to create a new task. And we're going to have a template for that new task. And if anybody here has already gone through the Ionic To-Do demo, they're probably familiar with this template. I'll go over the template in a second, but let's actually just see it in action. So this time, instead of starting with 3 pre-initialized tasks, I started with no tasks, because I've added the functionality of being able to, I've added the functionality in order to create a new task. So now I start with no tasks at all. And now I use the Ionic Modal, which allows me to grab that template from the HTML. And then once I've created the task, I'm going to just push that onto my tasks at the end, adding a new task to my tasks array. Let's take a look at the demo now. So here's my modal. I'll bring that up again. So here's ng template. So basically, it's a bunch of HTML defining what we see when I click on new task. And of course, because I'm using Ionic, we've got this great animation that happens. I can cancel it and say new again. And what do you want to do? I'm going to say, I want to create a new task. And I create it, and there it is. And I have all the old functionality that was there before. Hell, let's create another one. Okay, that's great, except once again, what happens if I hit refresh? Gone. I still have no local storage. I'm gaining the functionality, I'm using Ionic, but I need some way to persist my data. So that's where the PouchDB library comes in. So my next version looks exactly the same. The only thing I changed in the HTML was to add the PouchDB library. But let's take a look what now I have to do with the application in order to allow PouchDB to work. So I've created a very simple factory here. I had intentions of, this is sort of a spike. So I didn't actually, I didn't do this test-driven. I didn't go through the best design paradigms for this. I just wanted to see what was possible. So I started with a factory, and I injected that factory into my controller. And now, whenever I create a new task, instead of, let's see, where's our create task in PouchDB? So instead of creating the task just in the local ng model, what I do is I actually add it using post to PouchDB, which is like a local NoSQL database. So I create a copy of my task and I post it. And then I hide my modal, same as I did before. So this is the basic change here is just this one line. And I only change it in the model. I don't update it in the UI. Instead, I'm relying on listening to changes in the database. So PouchDB has the ability to register to listen to changes. And so now what I'm doing is on change, I check to see if the change is a delete change. And if it's not a delete change, then I'm going to get the ID of the change and actually get the document for that ID. And I'm going to look to see if that, very inefficiently I might add, I'm going to look to see if that already exists. So I'm looping through the task that already exists, and I'm testing to see if the IDs match. And if the IDs match, then I replace the task that's inside my model with the document I fetched from PouchDB. And if the doc was not found, that means I'm going to add it to the end. So any modification I make, this change will note. It'll go through and say what was changed. If what was changed already exists, it's going to change the model. And if what was changed didn't exist, because it's actually a creation, then it's going to add it to the end of my list of tasks. And I also want to have the ability to update a task. So when I change the completion and I click on a task and I mark it as complete, that's a modification. So let's take a look at the HTML. So here I am in my completion changed. Let's go back here and look at completion changed again. Whenever I modify a task, I'm going to call update on that task, whether that be so now let's take a look at the app in action. You're not going to see much changes here except for one major one. So I'm going to create a task, and let's create another task. So what's the difference? There's only one major difference. When I hit refresh, everything's still there. So what's happening is the moment the app loads, we're actually going to be looking in the PouchDB database. And that onChange request is going to loop through all of the items that have been saved in the database and add them back to my model. So that's the power of having PouchDB now. So now I could shut this down and come back later, and I could actually launch this as a very simple to-do app for iPhone or Android, and it would work. It doesn't have any it doesn't have any storage on a server anywhere, but as long as I don't delete the app, my to-do items are going to persist locally. So that's great for that, but now we need to be able to save these someplace that's not local. We need to be able to synchronize this with the server somewhere. So let's take a look at our next version, version 5. So now I'm adding edit and delete buttons to my UI. So I'm going to be able to edit the title of a task, and I'm going to be able to delete a task. Important functionality for a to-do app. And then let's take a look at the actual code I've written here for that. So we needed to change the OnChangeListener so that, I remember I said if the change is not a delete, then we're going to see if the task already exists in our model and add it if it doesn't. Well, what if it is a delete? Then we have to actually go and splice the task out of our task array. So that's what we need to do if the task already exists. And if we actually call delete from the user interface, the first thing I do from the UI is I'm actually deleting it in the PouchDB database. And so I got a little fancy here, and I decided to try and use the new Ionic Popup for the edit title. It's a relatively new feature, and I think I might have found some bugs with it that I'll ask you about later. One of the frustrating things about it was there was no way for me to pre-populate the text in the Ionic Popup. And if there had been, this would have been 3 lines of code. And that's what I was looking forward to. If I could have pre-populated the text, this would have been like nothing. Unfortunately, because I couldn't pre-populate the text, I actually had to include a template. And then once I included the template, for some reason, the submit button didn't work. And then there seemed to be something wrong with the scope. I had to actually go into a child tail to get at the whatever. Let's take a look at it in action. You know, it's bleeding edge stuff. So this is version 5. So now, because let's take a look at the HTML before I actually do it. These are Ion option buttons. How do Ion option buttons work? If I slide to the left, hey, Ionic, pretty cool. So now we have 2 options. Now I wish I could have slid to the right instead of to the left. Why? Because then I wouldn't be hiding the actual task title. So that would have been a nice little feature. But you know, first things first, so now I can click edit, and here's my Ionic Popup. And I was able to, with a lot of code, pre-populate it with create a different task. And I can spell different properly. And when I click save, now I see the changes here. And of course, I can delete a task just by clicking the delete button. And if I hit refresh, everything's still saved. So I've added that new functionality. What's left to do? What's left to do? Oh yeah, we want to synchronize this somewhere. And I did mention that for this, you're going to need CouchDB. So I've already pre-installed CouchDB, and unfortunately, I can't see the icon at the top very easily, but I wanted to show it to you. Well, I'll just take, I didn't tell it to automatically, here we go. There's CouchDB. Let's open the admin console just so you guys can see it. So because, well, let's blow this one out of the water because we're starting from scratch. So I have CouchDB running. It's running locally on port 5984. And let's go to our final version of the application now. So notice it has all the exact same information as the last version because it too has been synchronizing. And we're going to show that in action. In fact, I could open up. Let's duplicate this. So now we're going to see some of that magic that looks like 3-way data binding. If I add a new task and create a task, we see that it actually is synchronizing. But let's see how the code works before we go through the magic. So I added one button. I wanted to be able to demonstrate being online and offline. So I created a button to toggle my online state. And that's pretty much all I changed in the UI. Let's take a look at what we have in the code now. So in order to have an online sync with CouchDB, I have my online, I started off as false, and then I toggle online with a function that obviously toggles the online variable in my scope. And if I'm online, I'm going to call sync on my PouchDB database. Now, sync is actually just syntactic sugar for saying I'm going to replicate to and replicate from. I'm going to replicate in both directions. And if there's an error, I'm going to report it. And of course, if I'm not online, then I'm going to cancel the sync. And that's pretty much the only thing that I added to make this function online. So let's go and see it in action. Let's get the full demo. Okay, so I also happen to have compiled this version as an iOS app so that we could see it working. Now, right now, I'm offline with my iOS app, but if I go online, got a small little bug, but basically, the moment I went online, it synchronized and it pulled in the tasks that already existed in the database the moment I went online. And if I go offline now and I create a new iOS task, but I'm on the subway. So that's not going to actually synchronize. But the moment I come above ground, bam, it sends it to the other version. And of course, we can have that same functionality here. I can go offline and create a new Chrome version, create task, and then the moment I go online, bam, adds it to the bottom of my task at the other end. Now, what happens if I put both of them offline and I start to do some edits? Let's say this new task is new-ish task. Newish task. And this new iOS task, not so new iOS task. And so now I go online on one. Now that's synchronized to the server, the CouchDB server. And if I actually wanted to, we could take a look at the server. Unfortunately, this is not, the server code wasn't written in AngularJS, so we don't get live updates like you do when you look at Firebase. But if I hit refresh here, we can see there's my to-do. And here we see all of our tasks, and I can go in and take a look, not so new iOS. So it's synchronized with the server, but it hasn't yet synchronized with the iOS version. But the moment I go back online, bam, and we synchronize. So this code I'm going to put up with various tags so you can see all the different revisions. And it'll be available on my GitHub account. And I'm going to open the floor to questions now. And thank you very much. Okay, I actually did look into it. It seems like the one that syncs last is going to win. Now, once again, this is something that I'd have to deal with. This is just like a spike proof of concept. This is not a final version of the application. But I'd have to write code. When I was doing my research, I was reading how certain apps will just basically capture the information from both because they see, or they'll try to do some sort of intelligent merge. Like if it was a Notepad application, you'd want to grab it from both. Make sure you don't lose any of your notes. Otherwise, maybe I want to intelligently merge. Or ideally, I could look at the date and time that I actually made the most recent modification and assume that one's correct. So there's a number of things we would want to do, but I haven't actually done them here. Oh, and speaking, no, okay, I'll take another question then, first. You know, I looked for it, so no. I mean, part of the actually, the last app I created using PhoneGap was a MongoDB app on the back end. So I looked into that, and we created our own custom caching mechanism because we didn't have something that worked like this. And the great thing about PouchDB is it uses the same API on the client as it does on the server, and that's very powerful. Whereas when we rolled our own caching mechanism, it was a completely different API. So you know, you have to know how the caching mechanism worked as well. Oh, I actually want to say one more thing about this. So I made all of my modifications in PouchDB first, and then listened to the changes and modified my model accordingly. But if I wanted true three-way binding, I'm going to need to rewrite this so that I'm listening to changes on my model and updating PouchDB accordingly. Like, once again, this is just a proof of concept. This is not final code. So I would want to create, you know, I want to create a more Angular-esque version of this. I want to be able to do true three-way binding, modify my model, and have the modifications to my model propagate to the server. And that's not the way this is currently written. I'm modifying a local database and then having that propagate from there. Yes? That's actually a really good question. I looked into that. And that's part of the reason why I created this little icon to switch between online and offline modes. PhoneGap has a mechanism to do that. And I believe that certain browsers have a mechanism, but they're like a manual mechanism. Like if you take the browser and specify that the browser is offline, not because of a loss of connectivity, but because you say, take the browser offline, they'll trigger an event. PhoneGap can trigger an event. But I'd hate to say it, but it might be something more like polling, which is not a great solution. You might want to hide that behind some sort of service. But yeah, I didn't find something that just was a ready-made, giving it to you already. Yes? It only syncs with those that are that fulfill the CouchDB protocol, and there are several. All of them open source. Some of them have more replication capabilities, and like CouchDB itself is, I think, bringing in some technology that IBM bought Cloudant, and Cloudant has some technologies that are being rolled in very slowly into the main CouchDB branch. And Cloudbase is merged with Membase, and Membase has some in-memory capabilities. So there's actually variants of CouchDB protocol. So I want to say, but no, they all actually have to. Unfortunately, no. But there are variations on CouchDB at the moment. There's not just one. Any other questions? Well, it is a beautiful day out, and I thank you all for being here at FTC. And oh, wait, I've got one more question before I go.
Yeah. So you said that the Google Docs is something pushing the envelope and making it available offline.
Yes.
Have you managed to use it? Because I just tried using it now.
Yeah, actually it does work very well. Now, first of all, I recommend using Chrome because they take advantage of certain things. You have to enable offline mode, so you might want to check to make sure that you've done that. And usually you have to wait for it to synchronize some of your documents if they're not new documents locally first. But yeah, I have been. If you're trying to access a document that you haven't, it definitely works. And what I was really speaking of when I mentioned that, though, was that they created an Android app that did it. And it didn't exist three months ago. But it does work in the Chrome browser as well. OK, I hear everybody getting restless, so I'm going to thank you very much. My name was Daniel Zen. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.